Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 7 game from the Grenke Chess Open. Now, if you followed the round 6 video, you know that I won a nice game in the Karol Khan against FM Iwo Godswan from Poland. And that kind of got me on the right track after losing the round before that in against a Grandmaster. So I was still trying to recover from that loss. And, you know, like what happened early in the tournament is when you lose or draw a game in this one, there were so many players around the 22, 21, 2300 range that you actually were going to be playing down for multiple rounds. So even though I managed to win my last round game in round 6, I expected to play down in round 7, and lo and behold, that wound up being the case. My opponent in this one was a FIDE master from Germany by the name of Max Hess, somewhere around 2300 rated. And a very tough test because, you know, you don't want to take any players for granted, and I can recall being 2300 like it was yesterday. So I really wanted to put my best foot forward. In any case, let's get into it. So I opened with d4. Max went knight f6, c4, g6, and now g3. Yeah, I wasn't exactly sure whether he was going to go King's Indian or Grunfeld, but since I'd already gone for a knight c3 and bishop g5 Grunfeld earlier in the tournament, I wanted to at least have a slightly different variation this time around, just in case he'd looked at that game. And g3 is a move that, you know, introduces the fianchetto variation, and it's quite a positional treatment against both the King's Indian and the Grunfeld, and I thought that a positional treatment would be nice against a lower-rated opponent. So after g3, he went bishop g7, and this pretty much nearly informs me of what he's going to do. Now I went bishop g2, and this is pretty much the last chance that black can actually go d5, because if you don't wind up doing it here, I can go knight c3, and then I'm actually controlling the square with 3 pieces. So this would be the last chance. And my opponent went for castles, and that told me, nope, he's not a Grunfeld player, he's a King's Indian player. So we're going to get a King's Indian fianchetto, most likely. I went knight c3. The reason I say most likely is because in this position, black could opt to go c5, and then after d5, the character of the position would either, you know, it'd most likely be a Benoni type of structure after d6 and then e6. For example, let's say d6, knight f3, e6, castles, and then e takes d5, c takes d5. And this is a very, very imbalanced position where you can see white has a pawn majority on the king side, but black has a pawn majority on the queen side, and there's some real dynamics here. But that didn't happen, but that's just another possible scenario. Instead, after knight c3, Max went for d6, and now we had like a kind of authentic King's Indian fianchetto variation on our hands. I went knight f3 to continue my development, and now it's always, black typically has a choice in these structures, and it typically revolves around where black is putting the knight on b8. If you go knight c6, actually, the idea is typically castles and then a6 and rook b8. And in many scenarios, black winds up playing like knight a5 and c5 and b5 and playing like that. The other way is after they put the knight on d7. And this is actually what Max wound up doing, playing knight bd7. And what that tells me right from the jump is that his aim is to play e5. Because with the knight on d7, the knight's not really doing much there except supporting that push. And after these pawns may be exchanged, black might have a nice outpost on c5. So this is typically the idea, the other main idea in this line. So I castled, and now black went for e5, and I went for the sort of theory-approved e4. Although I must say I've never totally been completely behind this setup, and I'll show you why in a few moves. E takes d4 is played, and I played knight takes d4, and now rook e8 puts some latent pressure on my pawn on e4. I've managed to protect it twice now, so it's not under fire, but, you know, knight c5 might be an eventuality, so the e4 pawn is kind of a source of counterplay for black in these structures. And I must say here, I've always kind of, I do know that white is better here, and of course I know that because I'm actually willing to play the position, but I always found it a bit peculiar that, you know, white was so quick to go for this, because if you look at the difference in the fianchettoed bishops, to me it appears that my bishop is stuck behind my e4 pawn, so it's not so strong, whereas the bishop on g7 has a wide open diagonal to play with. So it's really this dynamic that gives the position a really, really tricky and tactical nature, because white definitely has the space advantage in the middle with this almost like Maroczy-like bind on black's pawns. But the flip side is black has a lot of nice piece play, and white has to be very careful not to blunder tactics connected to the e4 pawn or even sometimes the d4 knight. There are times when if the queen leaves the protection of that knight, where there's some knight takes e4 and bishop takes d4 action that can happen too. So it's always a very, very tricky looking position to handle, and I must say I wasn't completely at home. I was aware of some of the moves in this position though, and after rook e8, I went for rook e1. I don't think this is the most popular move. I think what they normally want to do is play h3, and h3 is a kind of important prophylaxis against the g4 square, because there's some times where there's like a knight g4 or even a bishop g4, and that's, I think, what they typically do. But I went for rook e1. So after rook e1, black now went a6, and a6 is a very interesting move, fairly flexible. The idea is that in some lines, black can actually try to play c5, and if once the knight's kicked away, even though black has a backward d-pawn, he's actually able to prepare b5. So you can imagine, like, if the rook is on b8 and then b5 is played and the knight is kicked away, if he's able to expand on the queen side, it can be quite annoying and dislodge the comfort of my knights. So a6 is a nice, like, high-class waiting move, but it's also preparing the b5 break. Now, of course, b5 is not completely realistic now because there's knight c6, and actually that would win the queen. That would trap the queen if the b-pawn moved. But there are just scenarios later where that's a possibility. Normally, what they might do instead is play knight c5, and the idea is you put extra pressure on this e4 pawn, and then white now has a choice whether to go like f3 or h3. Typically, again, covering the g4 square is important. And then sometimes black manages to play a5 and anchor that knight. So, for instance, let's say I played f3 and now a5. Well, you can see here that this knight on c5 can't be kicked away because a5 controls that b4 square. And in the meantime, it's actually quite active. So, again, white is definitely better in these positions because he has the more space in the center with his pawns. But the flip side is that black has very good compensation on the dark squares, and this bishop has real potential. Whereas mine on g2 also has potential, but it's going to take quite a long time for it to really be a really critical factor. So anyways, after a6, I actually decided to go h3. And I had a real debate on my hands, actually, whether to play f3 or h3, and I thought there were pros and cons to both. Like I just mentioned, if I play f3, you can see this bishop is definitely shut out for a while here, and I thought that maybe in some scenarios I might actually want to play f4 later, so it didn't make sense to me to play f3 when I might actually wind up doing that later. The flip side is that this diagonal, the g1 to a7 diagonal is a little more sensitive when you play f3, and so I thought that I didn't want to necessarily weaken that diagonal, and that's why I thought h3 made a little bit more sense. So now black went rook b8, again kind of gearing up for this b5 move, but again not before he plays c5 because he cannot allow knight c6. But this is a very interesting strategy, and I think the thing that was, really interesting about it is that it's really dynamic, and it forces me to make some really concrete decisions, because if I can't really sit back and play c5 and just allow c5 to happen without having my own play. So that's kind of the thing, is that black's coming really quickly. Now the flip side is that because he's pretty much telegraphing his plan in some ways, I can deal with it prophylactically. So the challenge is, where do I want to put my knight on d4 after it's hit? And also, how do I deal with the impending counterplay on this diagonal if b5 and c5 might come? So I wound up playing a4 here, and I decided, to just stop b5 altogether, because I felt that allowing him this expansion on the queen side would be a little bit more than I could handle. But I could have been a little bit more restrained and actually played rook b1. And rook b1 is a nice bit of prophylaxis that just says, you know what, get out of the diagonal of that bishop on g7. And now if black, advances with knight e5, and I can play b3 to cover the c4 pawn. And after c5, just drop the knight back. And again, there's no crazy tactics on this diagonal anymore because my rook's on b1. There's some lines where there's wild sacrifices with like bishop takes h3 and knight f3, or sometimes kamikazes where like these knights get out of the way of the diagonal and the bishop is raking. So this would be a nice little bit of prophylaxis. And you can see here that if white is well prepared for the break on the queen side, black does have a really big weakness on d6, and in particular the d5 square. So these are some things I could have, kind of gone for. The line could continue knight c6, now trying to cover that weakness with knight d4, and then a4 now, and you see now that I've gotten out of the way of the diagonal again, there's no tactics here. So there's no way that the knight can move and sort of create a menacing discovery. So white would just be a little bit better here. Instead, I played a4, and a4 is not a bad move, but the thing is it does create some dark square weaknesses. So, for instance, b4 is now weak. a5 is also a little bit sensitive, but it's really primarily the b4 and b3 squares are sensitive, and they're squares I cannot, cover with my pawns again because I've played a4 and c4. So you kind of have to just be aware of the weaknesses you create. And I mean, I kind of rationalized the weaknesses by saying, well, it's not so easy for black to take advantage. I did recognize that a knight might, come to c5 one day and also be eyeing some of these squares, but I thought that one piece alone can't, take advantage of these weaknesses. So it is what it is. So anyways, knight e5 was played, so I guess I reasoned correctly because he didn't go to c5. And my c4 pawn is hit, so I decided to play b3, just protecting it. And now black played the extremely thematic c5. And again, this was kind of the idea of the rook b8 plan. a6 and rook b8 is to play like this. And so now c5, my knight has to move. I decided to play knight de2, but an argument could be made for knight c2. It's actually a little bit more solid. The reason for that is actually because the knight is protecting the rook on a1, so there aren't any tricky tactics along this diagonal. And so play could continue like bishop e6. Again, let's just say rook b1, and I managed to get out of the way of any tactics, and I'm okay. Now, you might be wondering, you keep saying tactics on the diagonal. What in the world do you mean? Well, after knight d2, there are tactics in this position that I invite, and I kind of rationalize that the lines would be okay for me, but they're extremely tricky. And here is what they look like. So this was not played, but bishop takes h3 is an option, right? And once this bishop leaves, there's knight f3 check. And I'm pretty much obliged to take this bishop because otherwise he's just won a free pawn. So it actually gets very unclear. I can go bishop takes h3, knight f3 check. Then very counterintuitively, the best move here is actually king f1. That would have been a tough one to rationalize because it seems way more natural to just play king g2 and attack the knight. But king f1 is better. Knight takes e1, queen takes e1, and now knight takes e4. And so a lot of different tactics here. And you can see now that the rook on a1 is hanging after a capture on e4. And at the same time, knight takes e3 is a major threat, and there's a pin here. So I'm pretty much obliged to take on e4. And so after knight takes e4, the line continues. Bishop takes a1. And it looks here like, black is for choice with the material, but now I have the very important move, bishop g5, securing the a1 bishop. And black needs to play f6 to hit my own bishop on g5. And after queen takes a1, f takes g5, knight f6 check, king f7, knight takes e8, queen takes e8, and bishop g2. It's actually white that's better in this endgame, having the two pieces for the rook, even though black has, two pawns. Even though black has two pawns up, and if we're just doing a material count, it would appear that black is, quote unquote, a pawn up if you count points. But an actual fact here that black's king is quite weak, and my minor piece are going to have really good squares to play with, and particularly this bishop coming to d5, and then my knight can wheel around and do something. So white would actually have the advantage here, and I thought that, I envisioned a position similar to this where white would be fine. You can actually notice that in this position, I was wondering why not king h1 before, why king f1? And you can see here plainly that the king is actually protecting the e2 knight. So that would have been difficult to see with the tactics at the beginning, but it actually turns out, to be very critical that I don't have to waste a tempo defending this knight on e2. So, but anyways, even here, the line continues queen e5, bishop d5 check, king g7, and after queen takes e5, d takes e5, knight c3, you can see here that my knight is coming to e4, this white knight, and now it would be hitting c5 and g5. It's also a beautiful blockader of the e5 pawn, and I just find it hard to imagine this rook on b8 to really hold the position together against the minor pieces because it doesn't have any open files to work with, and rooks need open files to really, prove their mettle. So I think white would be better here. Anyways, these tactics did not happen. I'm not even sure if my opponent really considered them or not, but I definitely did, and well, I guess I'm fortunate that he didn't go for it because I didn't see king f1, but who knows. So anyways, after knight de2, knight c6 was played. That's another thematic idea. Point being that now that my knight has been cleared away from d4 and I've managed to play b3 and a4 on the queen side, you can see there's some really sensitive dark squares that he can play on. The flip side now is that since he has played c5, this d6 pawn is a chronic weakness. So I thought here that I would have a really nice time just if I managed to consolidate a little bit more, avoid any tactics. I thought that I would have a great chances playing against the structure. So anyways, I went bishop e3. I thought this was logical, overprotecting the d4 square from knight jump, and also getting closer to connecting my rooks, which is pretty important and obviously hasn't been done yet. Another move that was actually really nice, and I honestly did not consider this, but I think it's very study-like and something that you can think about maybe doing in your own games if it comes up, is the amazing move rook a2. And this is a computer move, but the thing that's so brilliant about it is you get the rook off the diagonal of that bishop on g7, and you prepare rook d2 in many lines to just double on the d file and attack d6. So let's say like rook a2, knight d4, trying to block me on the d file, and now I can actually just go rook d2 anyway. And the point is I'm hammering away at the structure, and the d6 pawn is weak behind it. And white would have really, really great position here, really good chances to win this one because it just seems like the space is becoming more and more of a factor. Typically in these structures, if black doesn't get any tactics in the early middle game, the end games tend to be quite favorable for white because he has all of the space. So keep that in mind too when you're thinking about fianchetto King's Indians. So anyways, I went bishop e3. Black went bishop e6, developing, but the bishop is not amazing here. I think the problem is that it, first of all, blocks the rook on e8, and secondarily, it's also a target for my knight potentially with knight f4. And, to add insult to injury, it's not actually hitting anything on c4, so it's kind of in the way, but I understand why he did it, because he wanted to connect his rooks. And note that, bishop d7 would not be very good because it would just hang the d6 pawn. So already it seems like black is, getting a little bit choked out and is lacking space. So, and the problem is it's not easy to trade pieces here. When you lack space, you typically want to trade a few pairs of minor pieces, but it's not very easy to do that here. So anyways, bishop e6, I went queen c2. I had a debate over whether to go queen c2 or queen d2. I definitely wanted to connect my rooks either way, but the thing is that if I go queen d2, I was wary of knight a5, and I didn't like b3 being attacked. And there were certain positions, believe it or not, where I was even thinking black might consider a sacrifice on c4 just to get some activity. I mean, here it wouldn't work, but I did think there were some scenarios where there's bishop takes e4, b takes e4, knight takes e4. And if he gets 2 pawns for the piece and a bishop, I thought maybe he has some counterplay. So anyways, queen c2 just stops all that. And now black went queen e7, finally connecting rooks. But again, very awkward placement for the queen because, again, it's blocking the rook on the e-file. It's not really challenging here, and you could just see that black is really lacking space right now. I felt very good about my position here because I managed to coordinate my pieces well and, managed to not I managed not to get messed up with any tactics pretty much. So anyways, I went rook a d1, just continuing to develop and centralize. And now h5 was played. And h5, I think, is a pretty serious mistake because it really, really chronically weakens the g5 square. And I thought, wow, like now if I put a bishop on g5, it can't be kicked away with anything, right? Because the pawn is on h5. And so I think if he was going to push the pawn, h6 makes more sense. But I think he was just trying to look for counterplay any way he could. And perhaps he was thinking about h4 as an option. For instance, if I just do nothing and let's say I go rook d2, h4 might be a little bit annoying because I don't want to take on h4 and, weaken my king side. And if I go g4, perhaps he was thinking about bishop takes g4. I don't know for sure, but maybe he was thinking about some type of kamikaze sacrifice like this where he finally gets some counterplay. But I'm not buying it here. I think that, white's still a lot better after a move like knight d5. So anyways, after I didn't, allow this and decided to play a little bit quickly. But before going to g5 with my bishop, I thought it'd be important to make a little pit stop. And that pit stop was on the f4 square. I played bishop f4. And I thought this was a really, really nice finesse. Because with bishop f4, I'm hitting d6. And there isn't a really convenient way to defend it. If you play knight e5, now the knight is actually not it's not amazing here, and I could consider now playing bishop g5, and then actually f4 just kicking the knight. And if bishop takes h3, trying to get some tactics after takes, there's knight f3. I can take on f6 first, and then play bishop takes h3. In these positions, even if black gets the 2 pieces. Even if black gets a rook for the 2 pieces, I thought white was still a great deal better here. But instead, after bishop f4, rook b d8 was played. And this was kind of what I was looking at because it defends the d6 pawn, but now I have this move bishop g5. And this was the finesse, is that by dragging the rook to d8, now the spin is even more annoying because there are 2 heavy pieces behind that knight. So I thought that was just a really nice finesse, and he kind of walked into it. Black now went queen f8, at least getting 1 piece off of that diagonal. But you can see here that white still has tremendous pressure, and black really has no pawn breaks. I mean, d5 is impossible. F5 is not really in the cards. And this queen on f8 is, not very pretty. So I'm in great shape. I could have actually gone in for a more decisive blow here. And, I have all my pieces really centralized and in great spots. But I still was thinking I could kind of employ what I, have previously dubbed the straw method. I thought that I had a series of advantages here, right? Space, central control, a potential pawn break. And I thought if I just played gradually, he eventually would break. And so I didn't think I would need to do anything crazy or drastic to win the game. And that was probably a misjudgment because in my attempt to do the straw method, I actually have a brick method solution here, which is really devastating. And the move is actually f4. And it's not even very hard to see. It's clear that if you play f4, you take more space and all that. But the follow-up is actually the key point. The point is actually if rook dc8, for instance, I actually have the move f5, which to my eyes actually looked kind of anti-positional because I'm weakening all of these dark squares here and giving this knight some life. But the point is that his queen is just too poorly placed, and he has, too little space for a few squares to mean very much. And the point is that, after bishop d7, I can take on g6 and now go rook f1, and the threats along the f-file are just decisive. I'm threatening knight d5, and the pin is just too much. And I even sometimes have rook takes f6 and rook f1. There's even knight f4. And pretty much, even though black has control of the e5 square for his pieces, it's just not enough. So I should have definitely employed the brick method here to kind of push forward while he was lacking coordination. Instead, I tried to play it positionally, and I opted for rook d2. And again, I thought, okay, I can afford to double the rooks and play more modestly and then wait to see what happens. Black now went rook d7, preparing to defend the d6 pawn, or over-defend it maybe with rook e d8. But I also think it was just to get the knight off of, or get the rook off of the diagonal of the bishops so that he can potentially move the knight. And now I went for rook e d1, and I thought, okay, this is great. I'm, doubling my rooks. I have more pressure here. Like, this is, what more can I ask for? And now black went for knight h7, and this was, kind of a very smart move, just hitting my bishop, asking me to make a decision, so on and so forth. I went bishop e3, which is retreating, and now rook e d8 back was played because now there's no pin on the rook, so he's kind of, putting the rook back on d8, connecting his rooks again. And again, I can try to play f4 here and play with the space and play really aggressively. But instead, I decided to play positionally and employ the straw method, and I went for knight f4. And this move just misses the mark a little bit because it allows black counterplay that, probably I didn't need to allow. And the move was bishop d4. And this move is not, a world beater, so to speak. It's not a move that, swings the pendulum in black's favor, but it's a move that bothers me just enough and asks me to make an important decision that I didn't want to make, and that is, what am I doing with my dark square bishop? It's pretty much trapped here, so it may need to be exchanged, and, I wasn't so keen in exchanging it because I had some sensitive dark squares that I wanted to eye, and so it's just a nice looking move, bishop d4, for black, trying to trade some pieces when he lacks space, getting some counterplay. And even sometimes queen g7 is now an option, and the queen pops out and tries to fight in the center again. So, very interesting move. I thought here for a little bit and played bishop takes d4. And then after knight takes d4, I just didn't love that this knight was getting super active now. If my queen moves like to b2, I was wary of knight g5 now, and all of a sudden he has some threats in the position. f3 is a threat, h3 is a threat, h3 is not a threat just yet because the knight on f4 is defending h3 as well. But in particular, you can at least see that the f3 square is sensitive, and his pieces are finding some life on dark squares that were once, roamed by my bishop, pretty much. So kind of a turn of events, and even in this position, white is better, but the move that the computer was saying was king h1, and that's just a very unnatural move to make to, I do defend the knight f3 check threat, but it's just a very unnatural to move the king there like that. So yeah, so instead, after knight takes d4, I thought, you know what, I am positionally better, I do have a better pawn structure, why don't I pitch the exchange? And I played rook takes d4. And after c takes d4, rook takes d4, the dust is cleared, and I have a pawn for the exchange, but I also thought I have a really great pawn structure because this d6 pawn is still very weak. The black's dark squared bishop is gone, so there's nothing raining down on my center. And I thought he also had no pawn breaks because d5 is kind of out of the question, b5 is out of the question, and f5 is out of the question because g6 is hanging. So I thought, wow, this is just a dream scenario exchange sacrifice where I'm just dominating on all sides of the board, and I could squeeze him from here while most of his pieces are on the back rank and he's super passive. And it's true, white is still actually a great deal better here, but I needed to be a little bit more alert than I was. And I think Max understood that positionally he was busted and had to be very quick and was very, very alert and played what I consider to be a fairly strong move, h4. And h4 is pretty brilliant because it's kind of underlying that, he needs to get some dark squares under control to get any counterplay, and he's asking me to make a very tough decision. If I take on h4, I've ruined my pawn structure, and maybe he pops out with the queen like queen h6 and gets some counterplay. So I didn't want to weaken my king side like that. The flip side is pushing that pawn, but if I push that pawn, I weaken a lot of dark squares. And then the other thing is if I just leave it and I allow him to take on g3, which probably is a decent idea, his knight might get active on g5, and again, knight g5 and queen h6. There might even be some world where king g7 and rook h8 happens on a good day, and he manages to play down the h-file. So I thought, these types of things I don't want to allow. I'm going to play g4 and not allow any pawn breaks still, not allow any counterplay. But you could see here that he's already secured some dark squares potentially for his pieces, and I still have some work to do because my bishop on g2 is not a factor at all as long as the pawn's on e4 like this, and I haven't opened up the position, so I have to be very quick with my play. Black now went g5, and I think this is, again, a very alert move, now recognizing that maybe he can blockade on the dark squares and get some compensation that way. Here, actually, white is actually very close to winning, and I just missed the important move here. Why don't you pause the video and try to find out what white should do after g5. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and figure out what white should do. What's the best move? The best move in this position, believe it or not, is actually knight h5. And this is not what I played, but it's super strong. And the reason that it's so strong is it actually prevents the queen on f8 from getting active. This queen would love to transfer via g7 to the e5 square, or maybe e7, f6 to the e5 square. But the point is the knight now controls both of those squares, so the queen can't get into the game soon. On the flip side, the knight on h5 also is quite passive and can't really get, the knight h7 also can't get into the game because the knight's controlling the square. So all in all, black is really tied down here, and this knight is actually leaving quite a good impression, even though it can't move. This is why I didn't play knight h5, because I thought, oh, the knight is not really doing anything here. I mean, well, it is doing something, but it can't move, and I was like, well, I don't know if I want to keep it there. Knight on the rim is dim, but it's just a very, very important move. And now the line would continue if f6 to cover the f6 square and maybe give black's pieces a little bit of life. His knight on h7 now is, again, still in jail because it can't move anywhere. And I can now go knight d1 and fix my other knight toward another sensitive square in the position, the f5 square. And the thing to keep in mind is that if this e-pawn is traded, or if it's gone from the board, all of a sudden my bishop on g2 is a monster because it's hitting the black queenside pawns, and it potentially has the d5 square to work with. So knight d1, e3, f5 is a really strong maneuver because you can't really tolerate the knight on f5 forever, and if you do, I have the d5 square for my bishop. Very important. And yeah, white would actually be close to winning here. I mean, the computer gives knight d1, bishop f7, knight e3, bishop g6, queen d2, just focusing on d6, b6, and now knight f5. And again, now if black takes, e takes f5, my bishop is coming in. Probably actually bishop d5 check and bishop e6 just to block the e-file, and white is dominating. So yeah, I should have gone for knight h5. Instead, I went knight fe2, and my thought process was, well, okay, he's played g5, and I'll be able to break up the pawns with f4, and all will be great. But the issue is that he's going to try and make that difficult for me, and if I ever do get f4, all of a sudden his knight on h7 finally has a square to work with, g5. So f4, while it activates my knight, it also kind of activates his. So it's very double-edged. Queen g7 was played. That's a good move. Focuses on the d4 rook, so now I can't even play f4 because he could just take it, and I can't recapture. I went queen d2 now to try and protect this rook and now train myself on the f4 break. A better move instead of queen d2 would have been rook d1. And the point is, if queen e5, now I go queen d2, and the rook is actually well placed on d1 because when I go for f4, I could transfer my rook over to f1, and it's actually can play on the f file. Whereas if the rook's on d4, it's actually quite awkward and lacks mobility. So in this position, after queen d2, knight f8, trying to get to g6 to stop f4, but he's just one move too late, and now I can actually play f4. G takes, knight takes, and now my knight can come to h5, my rook can come to f1, and I'm back in business. Instead, queen d2 is a little bit clumsy because of that. This rook here is now not really a rook right now. It's kind of just sitting there. Now I am attacking d6, so black goes queen e5 to cover that one. But you could see in the past 5 or so moves, look at the dark square control he's managed to muster up in this position where he was lacking all of the space. Very impressive scrambling by Max, in my opinion. I thought that was really, really nice maneuvering. After queen e5, I went king h1. I'm not so sure I can explain this move, honestly. I think I was just trying to get some prophylaxis going to get f4 in. Oh, I remember now. The reason I went king h1 was because I thought that maybe there is a world where I can go knight g1 and knight f3. And again, I was unsure of the consequences of f4 now because I thought that if I play f4, after e takes f4, knight takes f4, this knight has a good square on g5, and I thought knight g5 is very annoying because it just felt like it's really unassailable on that square. So I didn't want to go for it. But I thought that if I go king h1, it was a little bit of a finesse because I thought if the knight moves away now, I'd go knight g1 and knight f3 and hit the queen like that, and g5 would be loose. So that was pretty much my concept. After king h1, black went f6, and this was actually a very good move because it kind of stops my knight g1 idea. Because now when the knight comes to f3, I am threatening the queen, but I'm not winning a pawn on g5. So after f6, I went rook d3, just kind of waiting, trying to, acknowledge that maybe my rook was not doing very much on d4. Maybe it can transfer to f3. But you could just see in the past 6-7 moves, I've been thoroughly outplayed. I've not improved my position, and black has made like several improving moves to get this dark square bind. After rook d3, black played knight f8, and now I have real concerns of knight g6. And all of a sudden, if this knight gets to g6 and then knight f4, I don't even have a break. So I thought now was a time as ever to go f4 because I need to do it before knight g6. But after g takes f4, knight takes f4, I really don't have very much of an advantage. Again, my bishop on g2 is like a fat pawn. It's total garbage behind this pawn on e4. And now it's hard to imagine it getting active anytime soon. So if you just ignore this bishop and you just see these 4 pieces playing, I'm pretty much playing a piece down, pretty much, because he has 5 pieces and I have 4, and this bishop on g2 is doing nothing. So I did think that, these pawn weaknesses would, give me counterplay, but again, I just have not managed to get the activity that I wanted. Black now went bishop f7. That's a good move. Getting out of the way of the rook on e8 finally, and actually controlling my knight on f4 quite well, so it can't encroach further in the position. After bishop f7, I went queen f2, eyeing the h4 square a little bit. Also still protecting f4. This is not the best move. A better move would have been knight f d5. And again, I was looking for these breakthroughs all the time in the position, but I just didn't. For some reason, I didn't go forward, and this would have been a lot better because now at least I'm eyeing the f6 pawn, and maybe I could transfer my rook over to f3. The line would continue bishop g6, And now queen h6 would be very, very important and nearly winning, believe it or not, because now I am actually securing h4. I also have some pressure on f6, and you can see the king is a little bit airy, not to mention the fact that the knight on f8 is actually guarding the bishop on g6. So the position does seem to collapse a little bit. The computer, wants to go queen g5 to trade queens, but the point is that I can just trade and then recover my exchange. And even though black has some dark square control here, I am a pawn up. And I can go rook e3 and then e5 and finally get at the b7 pawn. So king f7, e5, takes. In this type of position, white would be pretty much winning because, the pawns would be dropping. So definitely should have gone for knight fd5, but again, you could see I hadn't really gotten a clear plan and was pretty much floundering. After queen f2, black now went knight d7, which is another excellent move. Now maneuvering his knight over to c5, and now all of a sudden, it looks like my position is totally collapsing. Because once this knight comes to c5, you can see b3 is hanging, the d3 rook is hanging, e4 might be a little bit sensitive, and all of his pieces are playing, or nearly all of them are playing and active, and mine are just not very secure. So all of a sudden, I realized here after knight d7, it has gone so wrong for me. Like, it has just gone completely wrong. And I was also, a little bit low on time, and we weren't at move 40 yet. So I had to make some really, really critical decisions quite quickly. After knight d7, I went rook f3, just prophylactically getting the rook out of the way of this knight c5 move, which I thought I couldn't stop. Note that b4 was impossible because there's bishop takes c4. So I thought, okay, maybe I could try and get some counterplan f6. But now queen g5 came, and queen g5 is another pretty good move because now he's actually freeing the e5 square for his knight, but he's also giving his rook the possibility to eye the e-file as well. And the queen is actually very well placed here because in many lines, if my knight moves forward, there's a queen c1 check sighting, which can be annoying as well. So good move. I now went knight fe2, retreating, but this was a mistake. I needed to, again, go forward with knight fd5 and at least try to attack something. After knight fd5, I'm attacking f6, and so bishop g6 could be played, just ignoring the f6 pawn, and this would actually be a very, very difficult move to see, in my opinion. The other point with bishop g6, by the way, is actually to cover rook f5, which is a threat hitting this queen. Now that my knight is on d5, the c3 knight is well protected, so queen c1 is not as big a problem anymore because it's not hanging the piece. And if I'm able to encroach here and push the queen away from g5, the h-pawn might drop, f6 might drop, and his kingside still very naked. So that was the key move. If knight fd5, again, bishop g6 does guard against rook f5, and I would have to go rook f4, believe it or not, because, again, exchanges don't really help me as long as my bishop is stuck on g2. So if I go knight takes f6, well, after knight takes f6, rook takes f6, black can just go rook f8 and force the trade of my rook on the f-file, and all of a sudden it's black that'd be better in a position like this because of the excellent control of the dark squares that he has. So it really makes my bishop a very just weak pawn pretty much, and I just don't have the positional control I had before. So very, very important that I play rook f4, but here I'm blocking the queen out from my king, and I managed to, hold my pawn on e4, and white can survive. King h8, the line would continue king h8, a5, and, well, you can imagine here that white is kind of holding, but black is not doing badly either. So instead of knight d5, I did go knight fe2, and this was just way too passive because now black went bishop g6, and now even e4 is hanging. And it's very, very difficult to defend it effectively without the position collapsing because knight c5 is also a problem. I now went rook f4, defending e4, and it appears that I have enough defenders on it. But now black went king g7, First, just protecting the f6 pawn, over-protecting it, and now preparing knight c5. I went knight d5 because I thought I can't stop knight c5. I didn't think there was an effective way to stop it. Note that if I go b4 to try and stop knight c5, now he puts the knight on e5, and knight d3 and knight takes c4 are both big threats. Again, look at this bishop on g2. Just a terrible piece right now. So anyways, king g7, knight d5, and now knight c5, and we still weren't at move 40, and my position is totally collapsing. I don't have enough control of e4, and I don't have enough control of b3, and now I pretty much have to decide what is most important. Now, the thing that I missed and was pretty important is that taking on f6 in many positions just allows rook f8, and it also gives him a file to work with. So I was really surprised that he could even play knight c5 because I thought f6 was hanging. It turns out that the best move in the position is knight takes f6, and after knight takes f6, black can actually play rook e5. But the move that I actually was scared about was rook f8. I thought that now, again, I thought that, if I lose my f4 rook, I lose my activity, and I thought I'd have some problems, but it turns out that rook e5 is stronger. And after rook e5, knight h5 check, I'm still kind of holding on. After bishop takes h5, g takes h5, knight d3, rook f7 check, king g8, and queen f1. Somehow, some way, I'm not losing just yet, and I managed to have just enough counterplay here to keep fighting, even with this terrible bishop. But I would, reckon a guess to say that it's much easier to play black here, given that all of black's pieces are fairly active. Instead, I played queen d4, trying to cover the e4 square and try to threaten f6 with a discovery. But this move actually turns out to be, the decisive mistake, because actually now black can play queen e5, and the problem is, the queen is coming off the board, or I'm losing a ton of material because now the e4 pawn is hanging, the d4 queen is under attack, everything is just, totally messed up. And again, my bishop on g2 is a terrible piece. So anyways, I went knight takes f6. This actually really accelerates the downfall. But this was move 40, and I was freaking out because I knew I'd have more time after move 40. I'd get 30 minutes. But it was also like, ooh, this is just such a bad position. And I had a hard time figuring out with the 2 or 3 minutes I had on my clock what I should do. Should I allow a queen trade? Should I take on f6? And I thought that taking on f6 would give me some counterplay, but I totally missed black's response. It turns out a better move would have been queen g1, trying to keep the queens on the board. But that's just a crazy, ridiculous move to see. And, I mean, it's so unnatural to just move the queen away after you played queen d4. The line would continue. Bishop takes e4, bishop takes, knight takes, and then queen d4 back, strangely enough. But, again, this is computer stuff and not something I would go for. So instead, I went knight takes f6, thinking, oh, this is a good move, right? Aren't I threatening knight takes e8? Isn't this, this is a check? So I thought, isn't this good for me? And then black played rook f8, and he made the time control because that was move 40, and rook f8 came like a cold shower. The more I looked at the position, I just realized all my pieces are hanging. My queen on d4 is hanging. My pawn on b3 is hanging. My knight on f6 is hanging. And my knight on e2 is overloaded because it's protecting f4 and d4. And so my rook on f4 is kind of hanging. And my bishop on g2 is a dead piece. It's just a fat pawn. So would you believe I got to move 40, and I honestly, seriously considered resigning. I was like, I pretty much have no moves here, and, there are going to be massive trades going on. And I thought, well, you know what? You're going to probably lose this one. I mean, this is bad. But I was like, let me make him prove it. Let him just make some moves, and, we'll see what happens. But I thought, okay, this is totally lost. I went g5 now, trying to anchor that knight on f6 best I could. Again, the problem is that if I retreat the knight, let's say to d5, well, I mean, something like rook takes f4 could be played, and I have to take with the d knight because I can't take with the e knight because it's overloaded. So I have to take with the e knight. And now just the simple bishop takes e4 does the trick, because now black can actually win this pawn cleanly and trade the queens whenever he wants. And black would just clearly be up in exchange. So that's pretty much the problem in these positions. Yeah, huge problem. So anyways, after rook takes f4, after g5, black now went knight e6. And this was actually the other problem I didn't point out, is that there was actually a fork threat as well. And this was a move I completely missed. Again, if he plays another move instead of g5, like if he takes on g5, then I have some chances, because I have some discovery checks like knight h5, double discovery, and that would actually be kind of fun line. Like knight h5 check. If the king goes back, there's queen g7 mate. So king h6 is the only move. But then after queen g7 check, it's mate anyway, because king takes h5 and bishop f3, and the queen would have to block to avoid the mate. So this was a line I was thinking, oh, well, he can't take on g5 because I have discoveries. And I thought if he trades the queens now, I have some positional compensation because my knight on f6 is quite strong, and I'm covering up my pawns. And now even h4 is hanging. But the issue is this fork on e6 just, has my position collapse like a house of cards. And to add insult to injury, if I take on e5, I didn't do this, but if I take on e5, all of a sudden this rook on d8 that's been passive for pretty much the whole game would just be a monster on the d file. And my position is totally collapsing. So instead, I thought, well, if I'm going to try and make it complicated, it has to be with the queens on the board. And I went queen f2. But this just allows him to secure an exchange. And he first started with queen takes g5 because he doesn't have to rush taking the rook on f4 because my knight on f6 is also hanging. And now I have to go knight d5 back just to protect everything. But after knight takes f4, I'm 2 exchanges down. And I just have a pawn to show for it. And my king is totally weak, and my bishop on g2, you've heard me say it a million times already, is just a big pawn. And somehow black still retains a really good dark square control. So I think it's actually just a huge lesson about the kind of latent dynamic themes in these types of structures, because you can see that even though black lacks space, he did have good dark square control, and that was the key to holding on to the position. And that's pretty much how he got all this counterplay and arrived at this winning position. Now, this should be a very, very straightforward win, and I cannot completely explain what happened next, because I was expecting to resign in a few moves, and I decided, you know what, I'm just going to play on and see what happens. And somehow, some way, my opponent was not able to put me away cleanly, and that kind of gave me some hope. So, okay, my immediate threat is knight e6 check, right? That's a family fork, all right? Got to deal with that. So black played rook d8. Good move. You protect knight e6. You also attack e4, and you still maintain this menacing pin on my knight. So it doesn't seem like I have many moves. I decided to, try to play as dynamically as possible, play for tricks, and I started with the move queen e3. And the idea is that I'm protecting e4, and I'm also threatening knight e6 check now because the queen on g5 is hanging. So a little tactical threat. Black now went king h7, which is fine, getting out of the way of that check, a very reasonable move. A better move to me and more straightforward would have been queen g3, because it's a forcing move that forces my queen to make a decision. Obviously, I don't want to trade queens because my position is I'm already down a ton of material, so I'd have to go queen d4 check. And now black could just play king h6. And strangely enough, on h6, the king is extremely safe from checks because the knight is 2 diagonals away from the king. So we know that if a knight is 2 diagonals away from a king, it takes 3 moves to get a check. And the flip side, the f4 knight is actually hanging because of rook takes f4 as a threat. So very, very secure and snug on h6. Instead, my opponent played, instead of queen g3, went for king h7. Fair enough. Doesn't spoil anything yet. Now I went knight takes g6. Very, very important. It's like the only move to keep the game going. The point is that you can't play queen takes e3 because I have knight takes f8, intermediate move with check. And then after rook takes f8, knight takes e3, it's actually white that's winning because I have 2 minor pieces for the rook. So, okay, so I've managed to get out of this pin, which seemed to be decisive, because if I don't get out of this pin, let's say I play a move like a5, well, now black can actually just go rook takes f4, and after knight takes f4, rook f8. And again, I'm going to have to trade queens now because f4 is hanging, and a position like this cannot be held because this bishop is just too passive on g2. So anyways, knight takes g6, queen takes g6, and now, again, I'm 2 exchanges down. I need to try to get some activity for my bishop. My bishop on g2 is just super, super bad, not doing anything. And one thing I immediately feared was the move rook e5. So, or even rook g8. So let's say I go a5. Now rook g8 is very, very annoying because essentially you're threatening queen takes g2, and if my bishop moves here, my queen is also is tied to the defense of these squares because of mate, and I just didn't believe this could be even remotely close to saved. So I thought I need to try and get my bishop active, and the way I did that was by playing c5. And the point now was that after d takes c5, which was played, I played queen takes c5. And my point was that in some lines, queen c7 check might be a little annoying, and just another thing to think about. Black now went rook g8, just getting the rook and the queen on g2, threatening to take on g2, threatening a mate. And now I went queen f2. And I thought this would pretty much be the end because even though I'm threatening some forks and a queen takes h4, it would appear that, black could very, very easily simplify the position, being 2 exchanges up. And that is what he wound up doing. He went queen takes g2, which, simplifies and, gets to a winning ending. Instead, I thought rook f8 just wins on the spot. Point being that after queen takes h4 check, queen h6, you keep both of your exchanges, and I only have one more check, queen e7 check. But this could be parried with king h8, and there are no more effective checks. After queen e5, rook g7, and now there's all types of threats connected to queen c1 check, and sometimes even rook takes g2 if he gets out of the pin. And yeah, this is just decisive. But instead, he went queen takes g2, and this does not spoil anything. Queen takes g2, queen takes, rook takes, king takes. Black's an exchange up. But I was quite pleased to get to this position because if you looked at it a moment ago, I pretty much had a scenario where it looked like I was getting checkmated on every turn. And now at least I have, a pawn for the exchange and a centralized knight. And knights can be fairly tricky with fork action in any position, but especially when you're low on time. And my opponent was actually quite low on time. He was actually down to his last 5 minutes here and, need to make some decisions. So I thought, okay, I'm going to make him prove it in these next few moves and see what happens. Note right away that knight f6 check is a threat, and rook takes e4 is not a possibility because that still doesn't get out of that check. So black played rook g8 check, and that's a good move, a winning move. A move that actually made me consider resigning. I thought for like 30 seconds, and I was like, you know what? I should probably resign this because after wherever I go with my king, there's rook g3, and that is a huge problem. Rook g3, b3 is hit, h3 is hit. this is decisive. But for some reason, I kept playing, and I played king f3. Black now went rook g3 check. I went king f4, and now black played a move that I quite simply can't totally explain. I mean, I think it'd be a lot easier if he just played rook takes h3. It's kind of the obvious move to me. You take the h3 pawn, you're still attacking b3, and if I push my b4 pawn, now you just go rook b3, and you're threatening to push the h pawn, and I can't even catch it because my king is cut off. So that was, to me, I think the cleanest way. But instead, he played rook takes b3. And this does not change the game in a crazy way. It's still winning for black, but now he has to make a few more moves. I went king g4 because now I thought, okay, I can maybe round up the h-pawn. And the thing that was kind of my saving grace here in this moment was that note that rook b4 and rook e3, both moves you'd want to make to get rid of my e4 pawn, are impossible because the knight is covering. So black now went king g7. This is another move I really don't like. Much better would just be rook a3. Again, just take a pawn and secure your passed pawn and start running it as quickly as possible. Important to note, too, that when you have a rook pawn, it's very, very difficult for the knight to catch. It makes the knight a very, very stupid piece. So if he manages to get this passed pawn with the rook, that's a rook's pawn, it's just totally winning. But for some reason, he thought this e-pawn is dangerous, and he needs to bring the king closer. Bad decision. I now played king takes h4, and now rook a3 is played, but now my king can actually come back in time and actually protect the e-pawn. So I went king g4, rook takes a4, and king f5. And all of a sudden, when you have again, this is also completely winning, but when you only have 3 minutes on your clock and, you thought you'd be winning in 2 moves and all of a sudden you might need to make 10, it's not so easy to play. And I just thought, play all my moves as quickly as possible and don't give him any time to think, and maybe he'll make a mistake. But it's, again, hard to imagine that, I don't lose this game. Black now went b5. Makes a lot of sense, trying to push that pawn up the board. Again, the rook pawn would have been the better pawn to push a little bit earlier, but now his rook is actually in the way of his rook pawn, so b5 makes sense. And now I went e5, and I have my own little pawn to work with. e5, e6, e7 is an idea all of a sudden. Imagine that. Black now went b4, and here I realized that if I run my e-pawn, I'm just not in time. Because if I go e6, he can go b3, and when I go e7, he actually just has king f7, and there's no way I can support the e-pawn and actually queen it, whereas this b-pawn is just running. So that was one problem. Another problem, by the way, is actually after e6, b3, e7, he can also go b2, funnily enough. And after queen, he actually queens with check. But of course, this would be a little bit more complicated than you'd want in time trouble. But in any case, I realized that I cannot continue to push my pawn because the b-pawn was faster. So I decided to bring my king over, and I played king e4. And here was my thought process. Black has 2 connected pawns, absolutely. But somehow, if my king manages to win one of those pawns, and he only has 1 pawn left, if I can get to a rook versus knight endgame, I can draw that. Rook versus knight is a draw. So if he manages to blunder one of his pawns, and my king is now in the square, I thought, okay, I can hold this. So that was what I was trying to do with king e4. Now, the cleanest way to win here is actually the counterintuitive rook a1, and it's not what he played, but it's very, very nice move and very, very instructive. The point is that I can't play knight takes b4 because now rook a4 actually pins me. And the other move you'd love to make, and I probably would have tried, is king d4, moving my king closer to this pawn so I can try to secure it. But now black has the simplifying rook d1 check. And the point is that after king c4, there's rook takes d5, and giving the exchange back, he actually queens. Because after b3, e6, b2, and e7, black now just goes king f7 to stop my pawn from queening, and his own pawn will go through. So rook a1 would be the cleanest and fastest way to win this one, because you also actually are getting the rook behind the pawn. That's actually quite nice, and you're starting to push your own. Another thing is, again, this pawn is not going to go anywhere without the support of the king. So so you don't even have to worry about the e-pawn right now. Instead, he played b3 check. And this is a move I think he'd love to have back because, again, it's still winning here, but the issue is this b-pawn is actually going to be quite difficult to defend if it's actually far away from the a-pawn. So, when they're connected past pawns, you typically want them close to each other, and here it's not really the case, and so it gives me a little bit of counterplay to attack them. I went king d3 now, after b3, and now black went rook h4, trying to get my h3 pawn and thinking he could now also protect the b3 pawn. But now I went king c3, and after rook takes h3 check, I went king b2. And here was my other idea. The king is far away from these pawns for now. It's far away from the queenside pawns. If my knight can somehow get to a5 and attack the b3 pawn, without this pawn coming to support it, I would have a chance because an a pawn is very difficult to defend if the king is far away and the rook is far away. So my goal was to blockade this pawn, but also try to win it. And after king b2, black went a5, trying to get this other pawn closer so he could, get a4 and protect. But now all of a sudden I have the very important knight f4. And this is a nice move because I'm hitting this rook on h3 that's tied to the defense of the b3 pawn, yes? And on the flip side, I'm also threatening knight e6 check, which gives my knight a transfer to c5. And on c5, I'm attacking b3 and stopping a4. So before I was thinking, well, my knight's is gonna try to go to a5 and then take b3 like that. But actually, it can also go via c5 and a4 to try and get the pawn. So very, very nice finesse to attack the rook and get this check. Black now went rook e3, trying to, attack my pawn. A better move would have been rook h4. And the point is that now after knight e6 check, king f7, and knight c5, a4 wins because I can never actually take the pawn on a4 with my knight and king because he could sack his rook and play b2. So for instance, let's say I go king a3, rook c4. I can't take on a4 with the knight because a rook takes, and again the pawn goes through. So if you went, so actually sort of counterintuitively, if he didn't defend b3 and actually went rook h4 here, he manages to get the two connected passed pawns and win the game. Instead, again, he actually only had a minute left here. He played rook e3, and this allowed me to play knight e6 check. And after king f7, knight c5, all of a sudden I've managed to get at the b3 pawn amazingly, and it's not so easy. Another thing that's kind of funny about this position is the king is actually dominated right now and can't move forward on the 6th rank. So it gives me just enough time to secure the pawn and also keep the king restricted, which is quite lucky, I must say. Black has one more chance. Rook takes e5 is played, and I played knight takes b3, and there's one more chance here to win the game. This is actually still a winning position. So why don't you pause the video here and try to figure out how black wins the game. It's not easy at all now that there is only this a-pawn left. And my idea, again, is to go king a3, king a4, and just take that pawn. So try to figure this out. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and try to figure out the winning maneuver. It's not easy, but the move to win is actually a4, believe it or not, pushing the pawn. And the idea is that after the knight moves, black has rook e4, and there's no way to get the knight and the king coordinated enough to get at the pawn before the black king walks in. So, for instance, if I go knight c... Well, let's start with knight b5. If I go knight b5, that loses a piece right away to rook b4 checks. That's not possible. And if I go knight c2 with the idea to go king a3 and knight b4, now the king can come in. So king e6, king a3, king d5, knight b4 check would seemingly round up the a4 pawn. But after king c5, note that I can't take it because my knight is also attacked. So basically the issue is that after a4, I can't coordinate my pieces fast enough to attack the a4 pawn. And the same story is the case if I go knight c6. King e6, king a3, king d5, knight b4, king c5. And again, we have the same problem where the king gets back to b5 in time, and then he can check me and win the game. But instead, again, he's playing on seconds now. Instead of rook e4, instead of a4, he played king e6. And king e6 actually draws, because now my king can actually walk over to the a5 pawn, and he's not in time to defend it. So I went king a3, king d6, king a4, rook e3, and knight takes a5. And he tried rook e3 because he wanted to try and get me into a mating net with king c5. But the issue is here I have the very important knight b3 check. And after king c4, knight a5 check, and he basically can't keep me on the back rank right now, and it means my king is going to be freed. And so he went king c5 again, I went knight b3, he went king b6, and then I went king b4. And now that my king isn't even on the back rank, it's actually going to be it's not going to be very hard to hold this because, my knight is always going to be able to check the king away. So now black actually played rook e4 check, king c3, rook e3 check, king c4, and then rook takes b3, and after rook takes b3, he offered a draw, which of course I accepted because I'm going to take back the next move, and all the pieces will be gone. What a game. I was so happy to draw this game. Obviously, I couldn't even put into words what it felt like after the up and down of this game, from me having a dominating middle game position to getting totally outplayed after my exchange sacrifice, to be losing, to want to resign at a few different moments, but to keep playing and to somehow pull out a draw in the end by a miracle. It was just amazing. And after the game, I called my grandparents in Denmark. I called my grandmother, my grandfather, and my grandfather plays chess. He's actually about 1900, and he was like, "How in the world did you not lose that game? It was unbelievable. It was a miracle. Your fighting spirit is amazing." And I told my grandfather and my grandfather, I was like, "Yeah, I have a totally new lease on life. It's like I was dead to rights, and then all of a sudden I got another life." And I could not describe it in a more fitting way than that. In any case, a draw against a low-rated opponent would mean I lost a point or two rating-wise, but a loss would have killed my tournament. So I still was in great spirits through 7 rounds, having only lost 1 game. And with 2 rounds to go, I knew that no matter what happened, I would never have a position more losing than the one I had in this game. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. I know it was a long one. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation in the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks.